Hi, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar with my guest here, Lisen Stromberg. We're going to wait just a couple of minutes to let everyone get in the room, and then we are going to move forward with our conversation, which will hopefully take us all out of the land of politics for a moment. I'm not sure what it takes us into is anymore.
Politics.
It's politics.
A different kind of politics.
A different kind, and I'm not sure there's that much more certainty, but it's a different take on it. I am coming to you from San Jose, California, where the air quality is bad again. So I've been in the house. This is day 3, not leaving the house. How about you, Lisen?
Palo Alto, same problem. It's just, I actually went out yesterday and saw this red sun. It was just kind of, frankly, a little terrifying.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. And my heart breaks for all of my friends and family in the community up in St. Helena, Napa, yeah. Santa Rosa. It's just awful.
I was explaining to a friend today earlier that I'm in a little valley and there's a lot of concrete between me and the fires, and the valley ringed by these hills and mountains. But, it's not that many miles away. There's a lot of real destruction going on. So
I know.
But I have my little.
Oh, your good karma. Oh, I want that.
I love that studio. I love that image. Okay, we're at 12:02, so I think we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Elisa Camahort-Page, and I am here today speaking with my longtime friend and colleague, Lisen Stromberg, the CEO of Prism Work. She has a long, illustrious bio and is the author of, at least her latest book is Work, Pause, Thrive, which is part of the impetus for talking to her today. But we're going to go further afield from just that. And one of the things we were talking about before we started broadcasting was that the Lean In organization came out with a new study that verified what I think we already had been hearing rumblings of, which is that the pandemic has been particularly hard hitting economically for women. And that something like 25% of women are expecting to either curtail, roll back, change, stop their current career or what was their current career, partially due to the pandemic. And I saw that, and I was not surprised because, everyone I know, whether it's a one-parent household or a two-parent household, the mom seems to be bearing the brunt, and we know that the data show us that the mom bears the brunt, whether it's a one or two parent household, they're both work or not. And so part of me was like, is this news really? And is this different from how things usually work? And I thought Lisen was the perfect person to ask, is yesterday's news actually news?
And the answer is, it's not news. This has been going on for decades now. And just sort of on a macro level, if you actually track female workforce participation across the United States for the last 20, 25, 30 years, we have flatlined at about 74%. If you actually compare that to almost every other major industrialized nation, they're up at 80, 85, 90% in Scandinavia, of course. I mean, it's shocking to see how we are in this kind of, place of stasis, which is deeply concerning. Janet Yellen gave a commencement address, I think at Wellesley it was, where she was saying, if we don't change this, it's affecting our economy to the tune of $3 trillion, right? Trillion dollars, lots of zeros there. The thing that's really concerning to me is that we have this narrative of women and their careers, particularly professional women, but we're not really acknowledging the truth around this, right? So 48% of American women work full time. The rest of that number of, 75%, they're all working part-time. So we've got this mythology. The other thing that's really concerning to me, and this is what I did research around my book, because I was looking at professional college-educated women who were mothers to find out how are they navigating work and life, what was going on. 65% of MBAs pause their career, as an example. So when we talk about the pipeline, there's some truth to the pipeline issue, right? If you go to STEM, 60% of STEM women leave STEM claiming as a result of family, and 50% of those women who leave the paid workforce completely for a period of time. This is not new news. We've been in this crisis for a very long time and we just haven't discussed it. So what's great is it's getting attention.
Right. It's a sort of new attention on old news.
Exactly.
But let's take a step back and tell us the story about when and why you decided to do the research that you mentioned that was into this idea of work pauses, particularly amongst women. And I know there has been prior research about this kind of women opting out of the workforce, which has made it sound like it's a privileged little, I'm tired of working. I'm going to go eat bonbons on the couch. Like it's a choice. And what made you want to explore whether there was more to the story than the typical opt-out language?
Well, two things. One, my own career has been incredibly nonlinear, right? I've been in and out and partly in and full in and all of these things. And I frankly felt alone in that story. I thought, oh, I must be the oddball. Something's wrong with me. So that was kind of this personal concern belief. And of course, but I was doing well in my career. Everything was going great. So there was a mythology. There was an inconsistency about my own experience that opting out didn't reflect. The other thing is Lean In came out and, oh, go on women, lean in, lean in. And I'm reading the book, looking for the chapter on motherhood. And apparently she missed that chapter somehow. And I knew in my own research and the interviews I was doing as a journalist in my own consulting practice, and in my own community, I knew so many women had had these nonlinear careers. What was fascinating to me is so many of them actually hadn't owned their nonlinear career. They hadn't said, I downshifted or paused. And, frankly, it wasn't because I wanted to, it was because the workplace was so punishing. I couldn't integrate these two things. And so I downshifted, but they were hiding it. And so I thought, okay, we got to put some sunlight here. And so that was literally the impetus for the book and the research and everything.
Yeah, I feel like there is some level of, and also there's some level of binary thinking around either you're in the workforce working full time and you're 100%, or you are out of the workforce and you're keeping your home and raising your children, and there's no in between. And yet that is not the story. And in fact, when you conducted your research, you actually found and kind of gave name to the different kinds of ways that we pause. And what did the research reveal to you about those different kinds of pause paths?
So I ended up interviewing 186 women. So these are, professional women whose names you would recognize, in Silicon Valley and beyond. And then I surveyed 1,500 more. And the reason I did that is because I didn't see any data, longitudinal data that really reflected what were professional women doing. Fascinating in itself, right? So the questions, again, the women I interviewed and surveyed were professional women who had children. And what was fascinating to me is we discovered that in fact, 72% of women, so first of all, only 11% of women said they planned to pause their careers. So, they had intentionally had that track, but 72% did pause their careers. So that in itself was just kind of mind blowing. And then within those, they had these different career paths. We had people who were cruisers. And a really great example of that is Jane Fraser, who just made Citibank. She was the CEO of Citibank, announced this week. She's a classic cruiser. She downshifted to part-time work for a period of time and then kind of relaunched all in and then rose to great success, right? Classic, right? That's a cruiser path. There were people I called boomerangs. These are people who left the paid workforce completely, pause their career for a period of time, and then boomerang back to their previous role or their previous industry and previous role. They're the ones who struggled the most, frankly, because they were trying to get back into exactly what they did before. And people had passed them by, there was resistance. So when you hear the story of how hard it is, it's particularly hard for someone who's going right back where they were before. And then there were pivoters. These were the inspirational people who completely pivoted and did something different or became entrepreneurs. So who's a great example of that? Tory Burch. In fact, she actually talks about her pause as being this white space that allowed her to ideate her business, right? And then she went on to great success. So there's these kind of, paths for these 72% of women that were not talked about and not communicated and not modeled.
Well, I think the typical narrative might be the boomerang narrative. I think most women who are in the professional world imagine that if they step out, that's what will happen. They'll step out, they'll be completely out, they'll try to come back, and they'll have an incredibly hard time. But just, you were purposely speaking to professional and college educated women. Do you know if there's research out there that also looks at perhaps other lines of work and non-college educated and more what we are calling essential workers today, a lot of them, and what happens to them? Because I remember there was a study out of UC Berkeley, this is probably a decade ago, that showed that, the opting out thing wasn't, on the one hand, you had the people who were deciding that it was more economically made more sense to opt out, and because of the cost of childcare of trying to maintain a full-time work. And then you had the folks on the other end of the economic spectrum who were opting out because if they worked, it would reduce their benefits that were helping them keep their family fed by so much it wasn't worth it. And there was this whole host of people in the middle who had terrible choices, basically, that there wasn't, because of the way our country basically doesn't support working parents in the way other industrialized nations. So what is the story for some? I mean, Tory Burch is obviously an incredibly, extreme example of someone who has that capability. But what about for the rest of the people who don't have that kind of luxury?
You just nailed the U curve, right? You've got women who are typically heterosexual in, marriages, partnerships, who have a partner that can support them. And so they have these, some way that they're not going to fall into destitution if they leave the paid workforce. Let's call it that. But you also have, scores, millions of under-resourced, perhaps arguably underskilled women who are forced to go on welfare because daycare is too expensive. They can't cover all these costs. Now, of course, what I think is, and then we have the middle, the struggling middle that, frankly, we're seeing teetering right now. This is the teetering unemployment ranks that we have right now. But what I thought was really interesting is all of that's, dismaying and concerning, and the lack of any kind of governmental support at the baseline for any caregiver, be it a woman, a man, God bless RBG, right? What was her first original breakout research was around men who wanted to be caregivers and weren't given the support to do that, right? So, but what was fascinating to me was the attitudinal difference. When a woman of means, we expect her and put pressure on her to pause her career because the best mother is the mother who's home with her children, right? But a woman who actually is out of the paid workforce, who's underskilled perhaps, we think she's the welfare mother. Oh my God, she's a burden. What the heck is that about? What's her value system? We don't think that she's being a good mother. What's that?
Right, but
oh, you froze.
She a strong single mom who, see me?
You're freezing.
Am I back?
Back.
So, okay. There's the case of the mythology of the strong single mom who does it all and works 3 jobs, and everyone who ever becomes famous seems to have one of these moms who help them do everything while working 3 jobs. And I'm like, I don't see how that should be anyone's goal to want to be that either, to want to
and they are heroes. Let's be clear. I spoke to so many divorced women, so many single moms for whatever reason, and quite a few single dads, including my brother, right? Single dad, primary caregiver. And he is just at his wit's end. And we have, again, no support.
No support.
There's no governmental support whatsoever. If you work for a company that offers it, you're lucky.
I guess my point is, let's mythologize them less and support them more.
Exactly.
Because it's so in a perfect world, well, actually, I'm going to add this little question before we talk about what companies should do. In a perfect world, what would the government do to address?
Well, maybe they would do what almost every other country, industrialized country is doing. They'd off paid parental leave, right? Just paid parental leave alone has a stickiness in women's careers, particularly. We see in Europe right now, Canada as well, these trends and longitudinal trends when you can show that you can offer a meaningful parental leave, right? Which is more than 2 weeks, by the way, or even more than 6 weeks. You find women actually staying in the paid workforce for the rest of their careers. So that stickiness of those early years makes all the difference. In this country right now, and you probably know this, 25% of American women have less than 2 weeks take less than 2 weeks, and all of that is unpaid after they give birth to a child. There's a wonderful organization, paidleave.us. Please, everyone go visit, support, advocate. They are actually at the grassroots level working with local governments to help them figure out how they can institute paid leave for caregivers. And it's not just mothers, it's fathers, we need this.
Adoption.
So that's a start. Exactly. You know, I have a gay son and his boyfriend, they want to have children. They're going to adopt most likely. Like, they want leave. What the heck?
Yeah.
Right. So
I always like to inject, whenever I can, a reminder to folks watching why state politics and state elections matter so much. Here in California, a woman can go on mat leave that gets paid by California's disability insurance. It's not her full pay, and it's not endless. You know, I forget how many, it's 10 or 12 weeks or whatever, but it is a state program that exists in the state to provide paid mat leave in a way that companies are not at all legislated to provide. So until we get to legislating companies to provide it, you're really at the mercy of your state. And who makes those decisions? The people you show up and vote for to be in your state assembly and your state senate and your state legislature and your governor. All those things really matter, and they get almost no attention. And all, you know, with our news dominated 80 to 90% by political news, the state level stuff really doesn't get covered. And this is just one more example where you are at the mercy of who gets voted into state office in your state, because there is right now no federal mandate whatsoever, right? So, I mean, there is the Family Leave and Medical Leave Act, but
well, it's unpaid, right?
It's unpaid, right?
You know, FMLA, right? Clinton, it got passed, bipartisan support, but it didn't have any teeth. No paid leave. Now, interestingly, what did Trump do? Trump passed the first pay for federal workers. They now have, I think it's 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 10 weeks, I forget the amount, but they actually have, the federal workers have paid leave now. That's fun. I mean, I don't have a lot of great things to say about Donald Trump, but if we can start there and do that, that's not a bad thing.
Right. And if someone with zero empathy can make that happen, then
what
can someone with a lot of empathy do?
Right.
So moving on from government, in a perfect world, what do you want companies to do to support great employees through these different phases of their life? And let's be clear, it's not just about having a baby and raising a baby. It can happen for so many different reasons that people pause. And there's also the caregiving of, as your parents get older, there's a kid coming down with some special need later. It's not just about pregnancy and birth and mat leave, right?
Absolutely. And here, I interviewed a number of women and men who were caring for their parents and were forced to leave for that dynamic. So you're absolutely right. It's caregiving in general, right?
Yes.
But I also want to make sure that we're talking about a philosophical undercore, because I don't know if you've been reading about the pushback that non-parenting employees are feeling angry and frustrated that they're bearing the burden of the relief that every employee needs to have. So there's a philosophical problem that we have this dynamic. You can't continue to work 24/7 and expect every single of your employees to be an ideal worker, which is what our entire corporate structure is built on and has been built on for 50 years, right? We have to actually change our modality and rethink what productivity looks like. So think about it. We did not think remote work was possible. We didn't think remote work could actually happen, that we couldn't be productive, that culture wouldn't be created. And gee, it took a little pandemic to prove that is utter balderdash, to be polite, right?
That is quite polite, balderdash.
So the point being that there's some underlying fundamental beliefs that we have about what it means to be productive, what we think about an ideal worker who's promotable, what we value. And I think we have to explore as leaders what that is. And that's a lot of important work and it's not just men who need to do this work. Women need to do this as well. I can't tell you how many women I interviewed who said it was the men that were their best sponsors and advocates. And they were kind of struck by women who, you know, I did it myself, you better do it kind of thing. So
well, can we just say though that we have a whole generational feeling of that with remember when, like, not now, but maybe 10 years ago, when millennials were really in their 20s and early 30s, and they were asking for certain humane treatment at work, that people who were older would be like, well, I had to pay my dues. And I'm like, you didn't want to work like that either, if you recall. And if they make it better for all of us, if they help bring some humanity into the workforce, I've always thought that millennials got a super bad rap for wanting to have employees treated
Humanize.
mainly,
Yeah.
even at the age of 22, you know?
Which is frankly why we're seeing this huge rise in employee activism, right? When we stop treating our employees humanely, they're going to behave and they have more power than ever before. But you asked a really important question, which is, what do we want them to do? And so one is that underlying philosophical, like what's your unconscious beliefs that are driving how you've structured your company? What are the values there? But then it's also about data. Look, I believe data, get the sunlight in there and get some sunlight and data. Do a staffing audit. And you can do a staffing audit before COVID. Track over the last 5 years. Have you seen a lot of women leave? You know, and at what point are they leaving? Are they leaving when they become new parents? What's that look like, right? Interestingly, Ernst & Young did a study in 2015, so it's actually old, but I think would be really interesting to redo, on a global study of millennials. And what they discovered was 72% of millennial men anonymously reported they had paused their careers, downshifted, passed in a promotion, left or changed jobs, literally, so that they could get more time with their families. But the difference is, much like those boomer women, these guys weren't talking about it. They weren't telling the truth. So again, there's this, if I tell people that I'm going to have a balanced life, that's a priority for this period of time, even, let's just say, it's going to impact my career and I'm not going to succeed. So
yeah, I think that hits everybody. I also think you bring up for doing a staffing audit. I mean, this would also help companies, I think, and that some of them do it around the diversity and inclusivity issue, because I find with so many companies, their numbers aren't changing, and it's not because they're not hiring intentionally. It's because nothing else they do in their company supports.
Right, they're not retaining them. It's the retention.
Right. So, I mean,
focus on retention.
Yeah, if you hire someone and do nothing to make them feel a sense of belonging and have a capacity, believe they have a capacity for advancement, because it's not just belonging. Belonging is like squishy and nice, but most people leave jobs when they feel, well, first of all, most people leave jobs because of asshole bosses. But the other, I always call them the 4 A's, and the others are acknowledgement, access, and advancement. And if you bring someone in, but don't give them any path to those things, you know, they're going to look.
I'm writing that down. 4 A's, everyone.
The 4 A's.
Four A's.
Access,
acknowledgement,
advancement.
Yep.
Don't be an asshole.
I love that. I'm going to tell everyone that. That's so great. And the no asshole rule.
Yes, no asshole rule. It's easy to remember. So yeah, I think that, and you know, there are companies that have experimented with flex work and job sharing, and there's limited in scope, and there's other more really broad things they should to help people not leave. How do you help people not leave, basically?
Well, I think the truth of the matter is that one of the pre-questions you said was, what's the silver lining? And you know, what are we seeing right now? And the silver lining really is two things, in my opinion. One, we're seeing some real acknowledgement that women are going to be, we're seeing a major brain drain. It's going to happen. The other thing we're seeing that I think is a beautiful thing that's happening with COVID is back to that. We're seeing work from home works. We're seeing we can do this. And I think that all of those companies that tried this in the past and failed need to completely blow up your perceptions and now start from scratch and say, okay, how do we start from scratch on this? And don't presume it's just a woman who's a new mom who wants this. It might be a marathon runner. It might be a volunteer, you know, someone who's passionate about volunteering somewhere. Like, blowing up our perceptions about flex work as a productivity tool needs to happen.
Yeah. And in this going on with this perfect world, how would you have employees make decisions about how to set their life work boundaries? What pauses, I mean, when is a pause really called for? What, independent of fearing for their future viability, you know, how would you wish you could sit down and make this decision?
So let me start with, I would wish no one would ever have to pause, right? And I say that because we need to feed ourselves. We have to feed our families. We have to do all that. So I wish that we had, this is my perfect world. I wish that we actually had workplaces that didn't require pauses. And of course, as you know, Lisa, I'm Norwegian, right? My mother was born and raised in Norway, and I have lots of family there. And in fact, one of the chapters of the book, I dedicate time, a whole chapter to my cousin, who's my same age, with kids our exact same age, and just our journeys, our career journeys. She never had to pause ever, because the institutions around her looked at it and said, oh, you want it. She never left, I should say, she never had to leave the paid workforce. She worked part-time for a while. She worked full-time all in for a while. She, she's had this dance, and she's had this incredible career. And I think if we could just acknowledge that that's normative and not exceptional, but that's the norm, that I think alone will make a huge difference. Yeah. But then back to the employee themselves and what employees can do, or humans can do. People can't control their pauses. Some people were laid off and it took them a while to get in, and then life got in the way in terms of family, or they moved, or something happens, right? So I would argue a couple things. One, for women in particular who are thinking they're going to pause their career around children and are questioning, is that the right decision? I think it's take a clear-eyed view of your financials. And really determine, does that make sense? I interviewed so many women who's as couples, they and their husband looked at their career as offsetting childcare. And I'm like, did he play a role in having those babies? And aren't they part of his thing? Why is your salary offsetting, the childcare? Right. Like, it's a combined thing. So, look at the biases you bring into your financial analysis. And also, your career hit is huge. My own pauses, I took 2 separate pauses. Both of them were about 2 years. We calculated that it probably hit our family to the tune of probably about $1 million or more over the lifetime of my career, in terms of stock options, in terms of, 401k, in terms of salary. That's a heavy hit. And if you had said to me at 32, when, after I'd spend months on bed rest with my second child, and I decided it was time to pause because my employer wouldn't give me part-time work when my nanny quit the week before I was supposed to go back to work, right? If you had said to me at that time, it's going to cost you $1 million, you sure you want to do that? I'm not sure I would have, frankly. I might have, maybe my husband and I could have figured something out. And we did ultimately. Is kind of that bold-faced look at the dollars, ladies and gentlemen, matters.
And I think you bring up something so interesting, which is about how the man in a heterosexual relationship, the man's salary and career path and trajectory and future is looked at differently than the woman's, as opposed to looking at them as a whole. And now I happen to know, my sister has her husband is a stay-at-home dad and a musician, and I'll never forget, I went to a panel, one of my earliest panels I went to after getting into blogging and all that. I went to go see a blogger I knew on a panel about women in tech, and I was super excited because I had just come out of being in traditional tech, doing this blogging thing. And the thing was, the 2 women who represented C-level corporate executives here in Silicon Valley both had stay-at-home husbands who right. Took care of the kids, and one of them didn't have kids, and so my friend was the only one who was like a single mom, and just the difference in lifestyle and opportunity was just immense. So I think people don't look at that whole compound the impact of doing that, and that has an effect. I mean, they say it about, this is the thing, we say it about global regions all the time, that when you support the women, they support their community. Yes. We don't take the same attitude towards the US at all. And like, so if we just allowed women, I mean, it's really funny to me how we look at ourselves as so different.
Exceptionalism, the American exceptionalism, right?
Yes, yes.
But you said something so powerful, Lisa. Yes, so many senior women. I think it was Anne-Marie Slaughter wrote about in her book, was it Unfinished Business? I think it's what she called it. She wrote about her in her book that she was giving a presentation to 200 C-suite women. It was, one of these big, private invite-only events. And she asked the room, how many of you have children? About raised their hands. Then she asked, how many of you have stay-at-home husbands? And about 80 or 90% raised their hands. The point is, just because a guy stays home, we're like, oh, isn't that so great? And I'm like, whatever, there's no judgment here. But my point is that just speaks to us not actually changing the way the work world is, right? It's still fundamentally the ideal worker. Doesn't matter what the gender is, we expect an ideal worker. So, that's not the solution.
Yeah. By the way, for those of you who are watching, you can use the Q&A button and ask any questions of Lisen if you have them. She's done all the research on this. And so if you have any questions, let us know and I will pick those up. Did I interrupt you, Lisen? Were you going to say something else?
Well, you had said something else. I don't think I quite answered your question, which is for employees who are considering this. So money is one driver, right? And then the other thing is two other things. What do you do while you pause, right? And I would say your career, every woman who succeeded in my research had a very long career. Even when they were out of the paid workforce, they still nurtured their careers. They still engaged social media. They were still engaged on the issues that mattered to them. They still maintained their roles. They still maintained their professional connections. And they were very actually out and proud. I'm pausing for 2 years because I'm going to be taking care of my children right now, but I plan to be back in and I'd love your support when I get back in, or I'm ready. That out and proud, transparent, here is my authentic truth. We hear about all those things. That works, people. So if in fact we've got women right now, or men for that matter, who are in this kind of what should I do? And I'm trying to figure this out. And this is just a hellhole right now with work and school and family and everything. If you're going to choose to pause, and again, I don't think it's a choice, but if you're going to do that, then be very out and proud about it and maintain your career. The other thing is don't do it very long. The women that paused for less than 2 years were able to get back in with almost little to no. In 6 months, they were back in full time and their careers were back on track without even a glitch.
That's
pausing briefly.
That's very actionable, like guidelines right there. So I appreciate that a lot. I feel like the other thing we didn't mention, which is also, you mentioned, what's your financial situation? The times that I walked away from full-time work that I had intentionally, I had a lot of money in the bank when I did that. I had saved. I'm a little bit of a hoarder when it comes to, I'm a cash is king person. So, but I think of it as my freedom money, like that I don't have to stay where I don't want to be, because I have that opportunity. So I was very intentional about that. But the other thing that we didn't talk about, which is just a huge thing in this country right now, is healthcare. So many people are so trapped by not just their salary. I know plenty of people who are trapped by their salary, but by their healthcare. And who's the one who's bringing home, not the bacon, but the healthcare.
Absolutely.
So if we could solve that governmentally, whether at the state level or the federal level, that would also allow there to be a different structure of the workforce. My next question is kind of a big, thorny one, because right now we're seeing there's this double whammy. All women and then also men of color are experiencing a double whammy due to the pandemic. Black and brown people are hit harder by COVID. These cohorts have more jobs lost. They're more on the front lines. Women are the majority of people front lines and essential, what we now call essential workers. More women are being more burdened at home. More women are stepping back from careers due to distance learning. So we were getting to a point where companies were maybe starting to talk a better talk about upholding and accelerating their intentions around inclusivity. I don't think we had gotten very far in many, many cases, but at least people were talking about it. And now
lots of opportunity there.
There's lots of opportunity. So how should companies be more intentional about not letting this moment take them way backwards on what they said were their good intentions?
Well, I don't know if you saw, well, there's lots of answers to that, but I'll just say one quick thing that I saw yesterday. My business partner, Corey Jones, sent out this thing, and he sent out that Glassdoor is now offering employees to rate their company around diversity and inclusion.
Oh, they didn't do that before?
No. So now we're going to see a whole new level of conversation, I think, around accountability, because you're out, you got people reporting on you. You can't hide it anymore. You wanted to manage the narrative before, but now you got a whole nother level of the inability to do so. There's a controlled way of communicating this if you're an employee. Look, you know, let's start with one of the fundamental reasons women pause their careers and believe and privilege their partners' careers. And that is because men make more money. So let's start with the basics on pay equity. And if you want to talk about Black and brown people, let's get, you know, Black women and brown women to be paid fairly for the work that they're doing, right? And don't tell me that, you know, I get excuses all the time. There's a startup that I just love called Syndio, Syndio. It's started by a woman who was a work, pause, thrive role model. She herself was just furious about the pay equity scenario. And they've got a whole SaaS model around helping companies. And they've got all of these very forward-thinking companies that are out there using their product right now to ensure that they have pay equity and can report on the pay equity, right? So that's one thing. Pay equity commitment and transparency around the pay equity, I think, are absolute table stakes for a 21st century company. And if you're not doing it, you're going to get screwed. And I think if you want a solution, that's one basic one.
Well, but let's tie this now to this conversation going on, which I just find it's infuriating to me that the first thing companies are seeing as the silver lining of proving that remote work can work is that, oh, we can give people
pay them less.
So let me tell you about my electricity bills, my water bills, my food bills with, you know, I already was working from home, but my partner was going to an office. And let me tell you about the greater, you know, our internet is, as you can probably tell, because I'm herky jerky sometimes, we've already upgraded it once and we're trying to figure out what the next level will be. There are so many expenses that are getting distributed. You know, he works at a place that built a huge, beautiful headquarters.
Yes.
And now all the costs are being distributed. And by the way, that headquarters was LEED certified, super eco-conscious. Our house was built in 1937. I don't think it's super eco-conscious. There's no insulation in the front half, the original front half of the house. So that, you know, it's been 100 degrees here. Our air conditioning is on. So when I hear—
There's a reason for the brownouts.
Yeah, no. And you know what I discovered, Lisen? No one else who isn't in California will relate to this, but I discovered that we're on the same circuit as a hospital, so we're never going to get an intentional brownout.
Oh, that was convenient.
Come on. No, we're good citizens. We keep our blinds closed. We try. But my point is that the first thing companies want to talk about is how they can cut pay if you don't live in a big urban center, but nobody's talking about the distribution of expenses away from the company and responsibility. I just talked about my responsibility for environmental choices. So now we're once again taking the burden off the companies, distributing them out to the employees. And how can you have pay equity and transparency about pay equity when now you're going to also have this, you know, paying by geography, not skill level, experience level, responsibility level? It's the whole thing seems like a big mess to me.
It is a big mess. And I think that we're going to start, look, I think, you and I've talked about, the Business Roundtable came out last year and said that the very purpose of a corporation has shifted. In the 1990s, great is good, Gordon Gekko, Wall Street, Milton Friedman telling us it's all about shareholder value, right? And we're now seeing a fundamental shift, and it's about stakeholder value. And when you have stakeholder value driving your purpose, going around and saying, I can save money because, you know, Elisa's moved down to Gilroy or whatever the hell it is not acceptable. It flies in the face of what we're knowing corporations are being called to be. And we as stakeholders, be them investors, be us employees, be us community members, you know, you're going to get called out. And we're going to stop using your product. We're going to stop working, you know, working at your companies, and we're going to call you out, and you're going to get more legislation if you keep this up. So do the right thing.
Yeah. On a side note, as part of the research, we have a chapter in my book, Roadmap for Revolutionaries, about economic pressure as one route for activism that a lot of people don't think about. Like, you'd be surprised how little stock you need to own in a company to be able to put a shareholder proposal into their annual meeting. But one of the things I researched for the book was this concept of shareholder value. I thought, like most people I talked to, I thought that was some kind of law. Some kind of law that public companies need to prioritize shareholder value over anything else, or they will be liable. It is not a law. It is not a regulation.
No.
It is It is, and it's also a tactic because in the 80s, I mean, it is true that there became these activist shareholders. Today, activist shareholders also kind of implies people that try to get things into the company's bylaws about environmental consciousness, you know, sort of social good type stuff. But, you know, 30, 40 years ago, activist shareholders were people that would sue or try to take over companies claiming they didn't prioritize shareholder value enough. And so companies got into this defensive pose of doing everything around shareholder value as simply a way of avoiding liability, avoiding potential lawsuits, even if they were frivolous. But in fact, there is no law requiring any company to prioritize only shareholder value. And that's why some big companies do give healthcare or subsidize education or pay over minimum wage. It's a choice. It is always a choice.
There you have it. So, and it's a choice driven by leadership. So who the leaders are matter. But I want to actually build off of what you're saying back to the point of, you know, follow the money, right?
Yeah.
Some really exciting things are happening right now. So Goldman Sachs has announced that they will not take a company to an IPO, so a startup to an IPO, if in fact that company doesn't have at least one woman on its board. Right? They won't work with you. 2, BlackRock now will not purchase a company. They are private equity. Now, they're not going to purchase a company. They won't do that unless they're not going to invest in the company unless those companies have diverse board members, a diverse board, and diverse leadership. That kind of forcing function is going to drive leaders who maybe either for whatever reason, either they're unconsciously biased or you know, for whatever reason, they're not thinking that way. They're going to be forced to think about, how can I actually diversify my board? How can I get that diverse talent? And a lot of them are frustrated by it, but frankly, I think we're going to see some real turnaround pretty quickly that I think is exciting. And it's all driven by money. The other thing is the ESG movement in investing, the environmental, you know, social and governance kind of criteria for investing is getting more and more important. BlackRock just announced they're going to be doing more of that. So we're going to see that driving a lot of positive operations, I think, which is exciting. To your point, you don't have to have a lot of stock to make an impact, right?
Right. And California, of course, has legislated that public companies of a certain size have to have diverse board members, and the bigger the board, the bigger the company, the more, because I think the data is something like it takes about 30% in a room to really change the dynamic.
Exactly
so
right.
For all of us who've been the only one in the room many times, it's hard. It's hard to solely change the dynamic. I always say I'm totally in favor of going Scandinavian on the issue and like legislating, you know, equity in some of these cases. I see no problem with that. So yeah, that is really interesting. And of course, our mutual friend, Lisa Stone, just released her white paper about the venture.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So she synthesized data. This was last week's webinar, actually. Lisa talked about, you know, she synthesized data from 30 different financial institutions who reviewed what happened when you have diverse founding teams and diverse investing teams. First of all, you need diverse investing teams to give the money to diverse founding teams, because the just don't do it. I mean, when I read the stats, you know, what is it, 13 years ago when we raised our first round of funding for Blog Her, I didn't know how rare it was. I didn't know how much the odds were stacked against us. I think it's pretty good I didn't know. Because it was 2% then and it's 2% and I read her data about what all, you know, investing teams that are all men, and what only 13% of investing teams that are all men invest in founding teams that have women. And I was like, how can it be? Like, that is, I actually had like a physical painful, like, oh my God, because they're still 85% of venture investors are men, right? So it's just, anyway, that's a whole other kettle of fish. We talked about it last week, and that the video of that conversation is online for anyone who's interested. But yeah, I do think starting to create these overt and explicit policies are an important part of instigating significant cultural change. And I feel like we need significant cultural change. And maybe, and this was going to be my question, is does the pandemic, I hate to say there's silver linings to any of this. I kind of hate that I will prefer to say what I heard Gretchen Rubin say on a podcast with Carla Hall this week that really, really struck me. She talked about not silver linings, but finding meaning, making the meaning out of what happened, finding some way to carry it forward. And so there aren't silver linings, but maybe there are learnings and drivers of growth, drivers of cultural growth, drivers of emotional growth, whatever it might be. And
I love that.
So
I did this webinar recently about kind of the transition we're going through in terms of leadership. We've had a construct around leadership that's very kind of what I call 20th century leadership. And that COVID, the meaning of COVID, this liminal time, this time when we're kind of in the cave, when you think about the hero's journey, right? What are we doing differently as leaders that we're going to come out and say, this is what I stand for? So how can we get clarity on what we stand for? And then how can we make sure we communicate, this is what I stand for? This is a beautiful opportunity to change. And I'm hearing it happen, across numerous companies, numerous leaders. I'm hearing those conversations of purpose and meaning in a way that I didn't hear 2 years ago,
Well, that's good to hear. When I think about the advice you just gave about how even if a pause has been foisted upon you in the form of a layoff, and I know many, many people who've been laid off, or many, many people like me where paid speaking gigs, events are gone, right?
Exactly.
Consulting gigs, it's a lot of stuff kind of evaporated and you're trying to build it back up. And I realized something. So you said this was your advice for everyone out there who's had a pause foisted upon them. Stay connected to the topics that you're interested in and stay connected to your network. And when I think about my own actions since leaving the company that acquired BlogHer, which I did 3.5 years ago now, I definitely have stayed connected to my network. But when I think about what topics and interests I have stayed connected to, it wasn't necessarily social media or marketing or influencer marketing, all those stuff that BlogHer might have been known for. I have not. So that tells me something about myself, which I also think is an opportunity in this time when I've had to figure out how to rebuild. And so I'm just throwing it out there for anyone else.
But you have done something that I think is very purpose aligned. One of your geniuses is staying connected to community. Yeah. One of the geniuses that you brought to Blogger that was the Blogger was community, and you continue to build community in other ways. So social media maybe isn't your spark, but community is. So continuing to do that and is powerful, right?
Yeah, and I'm doing it more around justice and politics. And although I've never worked for a nonprofit in my life, I mean, what was the book I wrote? It was about activism. And I think about this the other time during the dot-com bust, when I walked away from my tech job, which was a very good job because I was completely burnt. And I thought I would just go get another tech job in that industry. And I didn't. And eventually I had to listen to myself and say, why aren't I out there beating down the doors, getting my VP job? And I'm having a revelation while I'm talking to you, Lisen, because I'm doing the same thing now, which is I look at all of these jobs or gigs that are around what I maybe used to really think was what I was doing. And they are not, like you said, the spark, is not there. And I think we should all kind of listen. This is an opportunity to say, well, what is sparking you? What is really making you get up in the morning and want to go work on first thing, and finding an avenue into that. And I've always thought that you can leverage skills across industries or functions, right? I used to give talks on how non-technical people like myself could get senior roles in technical organizations. And a big part of that was always talking about the skills I had in my other career and how they applied in a technical career.
That's a classic work, pause, thrive dynamic. The women who succeeded after pausing in the research I did, they were able to translate all the skills they had before, the skills they gained while they paused. Many of them took leadership roles either in their schools or in their volunteer community or whatever, and then transitioned that into and added the spark, right? Wrap it up with spark, and they're able to, land their, on the path to the next big gig because they had much more clarity and were empowered around, here's what I did. Right?
Yeah.
What did you do in your pause? Oh, you wrote a book. Hello. That's not a pause. That is a spark. That is a new evolution. So, hey, more of that, please.
Yeah. So yeah, I think there is this opportunity to look at what really sparks you, to translate your skills for other opportunities, and and we are all at home now. So no one's out going to the mixers you can't go to. No, I mean, that happens to women so much, right? That, you got to get home, and you're not going to the 5 o'clock beer bash or whatever. I don't know. I don't even know if Silicon Valley has beer bashes anymore. I was so removed from that. But, that was always an issue for women, that there was this responsibility and burden that kept them from some of the networking opportunities. Well, none of us are doing beer bashes right now. So we're all kind of equalized in this way. And also we're all I feel like people are way more open to one-on-one, like someone reaches out and wants to connect. Like a lot of people are like, sure, I'm not connecting in other ways. So I think we're a little bit, eager and hungry for connection. So
isn't that so beautiful? The human desire for connection, the human desire for community. That's so powerful. And you're right. We have an opportunity now.
Yes, it is powerful. Although the downside of it is, I think it's what keeps driving these resurgences of COVID, because
Oh, right. Well, there's that too, right? I know.
Like California, we did so well the first 3 months, and then Memorial Day rolled around and we were like, that's it. I gave you all I got to give. I'm going out and
done with that.
Talk about unexpected positives. I was so afraid of a Labor Day resurgence, and the sky and the air was so bad. I think people just hunkered down.
Exactly.
And because Memorial Day and July 4th, we saw surges afterwards.
Yes.
So anyway, that's a little far afield of our topic, but
it is all aligned, right?
Yes, it's all. That's the other thing. It's like our lives are all now it's so intertwined right now.
Yes.
As
it should be. I actually think that's a wonderful thing, right? It's like so many people telling me, oh, I didn't know that, about your beautiful, hugging, your little bear hugging California thing. I didn't know that side of Elisa, right? There's all these things that we're seeing in people's, offices and their lives. And
it's funny. I used to use virtual not virtual backgrounds, but I downloaded some backgrounds, but because I have dark hair, it doesn't work that well. And I look like I have this sort of alien misshapen head. So instead I crafted my, my Zoom, I call it my Zoomscape, and it tells you, this is the Constitution. If you can't, I got my Black Lives Matter sign I take to protest. This says I won't be remembered as a woman who kept her mouth shut. I got my Kamala and Joe action figures. I got my California. My book. Love it. See what is behind you? What is in your Zoomscape?
Well, oh my gosh, so much. Books, more books.
Yes.
I'm an avid reader, and I love reading books. That is the first award I ever received for writing. I had always wanted to be a writer, and I grew up being told you can't make money as a writer, and so I didn't pursue that as a career. So having that first award really is meaningful to me. My book, of course. And then a picture of my husband, and I got pictures of my family and friends.
Is that your wedding?
Oh my God, that's my little wedding picture out there. We can leave it there.
I really think we have this opportunity. Every now and then there's a cat in my Zoomscape too, but they're not in here right now. So, but I super love it. I super love seeing what everybody's background is and why.
Why, right?
And why. And why. So Lisen, thank you so much. As we mentioned, this is going to be recorded and available to share. And so everyone can benefit from your wisdom and try to figure out how to bridge whatever gaps we are experiencing right now. And know that for a lot of people, there is a there on the other side of such gaps.
And there are those of us waiting for you, right?
That's nice.
Community on the other side.
That's nice. Thank you so much. And thank you all of you who joined us. And we will see you next week with more great content from remotely.